Welcome to Wife Cheating Story. I hope you have an enjoyable and relaxing time listening. Let's get started.
Welcome back to my channel. Before we begin, let me know where you're tuning in from down in the comments. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next tale. For 5 years, I'd built a fortress. Not of stone and steel, but of glass, code, and emotional distance. My penthouse office overlooks Central Park, a sterile, minimalist space where every object has a purpose and every interaction is transactional. The view from the 42nd floor is my bulwark against the chaos of the world, a daily reminder that I am above it all now. Untouchable. My company, Obsidian Forensics, is the fortress itself. We are the digital ghosts who walk through the firewalls of the world's most powerful corporations, finding the secrets they try to bury. I built it from nothing, fueled by caffeine and a cold, simmering rage that never quite cooled. I live in a world of encrypted data and clean, logical outcomes. There are no messy emotions in binary code. There is only true or false. But today, a simple analog object breached every defense I'd ever constructed. It arrived via courier, a small, heavy box of dark oak. It felt ancient, out of place in my chrome and glass world. My assistant, Josephine, a woman with an unflappable demeanor and a mind as sharp as a server blade, placed it on my desk with a look that was a rare mixture of curiosity and concern. "It's from a Mr. Arthur Abernathy in Port Sterling," she said, her voice soft. "The law firm handling your mother's estate." I just nodded, my throat suddenly tight. I hadn't spoken my mother's name aloud in 2 weeks. It felt like swallowing glass. "Thank you, Josephine. Hold my calls." She gave a single, understanding nod and slipped out of the room, the door closing with a silent, hydraulic hiss. I stared at the box. Port Sterling. A name I hadn't typed, written, or spoken in 5 years. A name that tasted like ash and salt water in my mouth. My hands, usually steady enough to solder a microchip, trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, was a single old-fashioned skeleton key. Tarnished brass, intricate and heavy. Beneath it lay a folded piece of thick, cream-colored stationery. The handwriting was my mother's elegant, familiar, and now a punch to the gut. "Oliver, come home. There are things you need to know." That was it. No, my dearest son, no, I love you. Just a command and a promise of secrets. The key was a moilua, a spark thrown onto the dry tinder of my memory. And the past, the one I'd buried under 5 years of relentless work, roared back to life. The images didn't drift in. They slammed into me. Flash. The scent of Jacqueline's perfume, that expensive one, Chanel No. 5 mixed with something else. Brad's cologne, the sound of their laughter from the master bedroom, a sound I'd mistaken for a TV show. I pushed the door open. They aren't watching TV. She's in our bed, the silk sheets I bought for our anniversary tangled around her legs, her head thrown back, a smile of pure pleasure on her face. A smile that was never for me and him. Brad, my biggest business rival, a man built of old money and smug superiority. He sees me first. He doesn't look guilty. He looks triumphant. Flash, the cold blue light of my office monitors at 3 a.m. My first company, Innovatech, my dream, turning to digital dust before my eyes. A data breach, a sophisticated one. Our flagship project, a revolutionary encryption algorithm stolen, wiped clean from our servers. A week later, Brad's company announces a new, strikingly similar technology. The board of investors, friends of Brad's father, accuse me of negligence, of corporate espionage. They call me a failure. Flash. The final drive out of Port Sterling. My car packed with a few boxes, my life reduced to what could fit in a sedan. The billboard at the edge of town features Brad's smiling face, announcing his company's new headquarters. It felt like the whole town was laughing at me. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I squeezed my eyes shut, my knuckles white as I gripped the key. The metal bit into my palm. The pain was grounding. It was real. When I opened them, my reflection stared back from the polished surface of my desk. A man of 34 who looked 40, dressed in a tailored Tom Ford suit that felt like armor, his eyes holding the flat, empty look of a screen that had been powered down. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. New York glittered below me, a universe of ambition and indifference. I had conquered it. I had built a new life, a better one. I had become the man who couldn't be touched, couldn't be broken again. But the key in my hand felt like a shackle, pulling me back to the one place on earth where I had been both. "Josephine," I said into my desk's intercom, my voice a low rasp. "Yes, Oliver?" "Clear my schedule for the rest of the week, and get the jet ready. I'm going home." The drive into Port Sterling felt like a slow descent into a past ID tried to outrun. I'd taken the jet to a private airstrip an hour away and rented a nondescript black sedan, wanting to slip into town like a phantom. The salt-laced air, thick with the smell of low tide and old money, seeped through the car's vents. It was the smell of my childhood, but now it felt like rust in my lungs. Port Sterling is a postcard of New England wealth. Historic colonial houses with perfectly manicured lawns slope down to a harbor filled with sailboats and yachts, their masts like a forest of white needles against the moody, overcast sky. The main street is lined with charming brick storefronts, boutique art galleries, overpriced antique shops, and a bakery whose window display hadn't changed in 20 years. To a tourist, it was idyllic. To me, it was a beautifully constructed lie, a stage set where every resident knew their part in the town's silent, brutal play of class and power. I bypassed the cemetery. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, I found myself on autopilot, my hands steering the car down familiar, tree-lined streets until I reached my mother's house. It wasn't a grand mansion like the ones lining the waterfront. It was a modest but proud two-story cedar shingle house, weathered a soft gray by decades of sea spray. The garden shed loved was overgrown, the rose bushes reaching out like thorny, desperate arms. A layer of dust and fallen leaves covered the porch. It looked neglected, abandoned. My fault. I'd paid for its upkeep from a distance, but a house needs more than money. It needs life. The old key from the oak box slid into the lock with a rusty scrape and a solid click. The sound echoed in the silence. The air inside was stale, thick with the ghosts of forgotten days. A faint, sweet scent of my mother's potpourri lingered, a whisper of the life that used to fill these rooms. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light filtering through the grimy windows. Everything was exactly as I remembered, covered in white sheets like rows of shrouded corpses. It was a museum of a life that had ended, and my gut twisted with a guilt so sharp it almost brought me to my knees. I pulled the sheet off the living room sofa, the dust billowing up around me. I ran a hand over the worn floral fabric, then my eyes landed on the mantelpiece above the cold brick fireplace. It was lined with photographs. I walked over, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the hardwood floors. Most of them were of me at various ages. Me with a missing front tooth, holding a fishing rod. Me in a cap and gown at my high school graduation, my mother beaming beside me. But one frame, set slightly apart from the others, caught my eye. I picked it up. The glass was cool against my fingertips. It was a photo from a summer barbecue, maybe 15 years ago. My mom was in the middle, laughing, her arms around two gawky teenagers. One was me, all sharp angles and awkward energy. The other was Brooke Evans. In the photo, Brooke was a girl of 16, her smile wide and slightly crooked from the braces on her teeth. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes, even in the faded photograph, were bright with an intelligence and a warmth that I remembered so clearly. She was my neighbor, my co-conspirator in summertime schemes, my best friend, the person I told everything to, until life and high school social strata pulled us apart. I stared at the image, at the ghost of the boy I used to be. That boy was smiling, carefree. He hadn't yet learned the brutal calculus of betrayal. He hadn't yet met Jacqueline. He didn't know what it felt like to have his world ripped out from under him. That boy was dead. I set the photograph back down on the dusty mantelpiece, my own reflection a shadowy presence in the glass. The man looking back at me was a stranger. His face was a mask of cold control. His eyes were hollow. He was the architect of a fortress, a king in a kingdom of one, and he was utterly, profoundly alone. A wave of exhaustion washed over me so heavy it felt like I was drowning. Coming home wasn't just a trip. It was an excavation, and I was digging up my own grave. The invitation, or rather, the summons came via text message. It was from Jacqueline. "Oliver, I heard you were in town. Brad and I are finalizing the estate details. You should come for dinner tonight, 7 p.m. For Stella's sake. For Stella's sake." The classic manipulation, her favorite weapon. It was a reminder that she held the one piece of my old life I couldn't completely cut away. I knew it was a power play. The dinner wasn't about the will. It was about forcing me to walk back into the lion's den, to see everything they had taken from me. And I knew I had to go. To show them I wasn't the broken boy who'd fled 5 years ago. Brad's mansion was a monument to new money and bad taste. A sprawling modernist cube of glass and white concrete perched on the best piece of coastline in Port Sterling. It loomed over the ocean like a predator. It was cold, impersonal, and designed to intimidate. As I pulled my rental sedan up the long, winding driveway, I felt the old, familiar knot of anger and humiliation tighten in my stomach. Jacqueline opened the door herself. She was a work of art, I had to give her that. Dressed in a sleek sapphire blue silk dress that clung to her like a second skin, her blonde hair styled in a flawless chignon. Her beauty was like a perfectly cut diamond, brilliant, sharp, and ice-cold. "Oliver," she said, her voice smooth as cream. Her smile didn't touch her eyes. "You look, well, the city suits you." It wasn't a compliment. It was an assessment, a subtle jab that I still looked like I didn't belong here, in her world. "Jacqueline," I replied, my tone level. "The house is big." She laughed, a brittle, tinkling sound. "Brad has always believed in going big." She led me through a cavernous foyer with a ceiling so high it could have housed its own weather system. The art on the walls was abstract and expensive, chosen not for love, but for status. Brad was standing by a massive window overlooking the turbulent gray ocean, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He wore a gray cashmere sweater and dark trousers, the uniform of the effortlessly wealthy. He turned, a slow, arrogant smile spreading across his face. "Oliver, good of you to finally make it back," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We're handling your mother's affairs, of course. Don't want you to be bothered with the details." He was asserting his dominance, positioning himself as the man of the family now. My family. Before I could respond, a small voice piped up. "Daddy?" Stella stood in the entryway to the living room. At 6 years old, she was a miniature version of her mother, with the same blonde hair and startlingly blue eyes. She was wearing a little white dress that probably cost more than my first car. I felt a painful lurch in my chest. "Hey, sweetie," I said, forcing a smile. I crouched down to her level. "How's my big girl?" She took a hesitant step forward, then another before giving me a quick, almost formal hug. It felt practiced. There was a wall there, a distance I couldn't quite name. "I'm good," she said, pulling away. "Mommy says you live in a big building in the sky now." "Something like that," I murmured, standing up. I looked at Jacqueline. She was watching us with a detached sort of amusement, like a scientist observing a lab experiment. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The conversation was light, meaningless chatter about the stock market, local politics, a charity gala they were hosting. But underneath it, every word was a calculated move in a silent chess match. "You'll have to let Arthur know what you plan to do with the house, Oliver," Jacqueline said, delicately cutting into a piece of sea bass. "It's in a rather rustic state. It's dragging down the property values for the whole neighborhood." "I'm sure it is," I said, meeting her gaze. "Some things have more value than their price tag." Brad chuckled, swirling the wine in his glass. "Sentiment is a luxury, Oliver. In the real world, it's all about ROI. Something you learned the hard way, I suppose." The jab landed, just as he intended. The memory of my failed company flashed in my mind. He saw the flicker in my eyes, and his smile widened. He was enjoying this, every second of it. I placed my fork down, my appetite gone. I looked from Brad's smug face to Jacqueline's perfect, cold mask. They were a matched set. Two predators who had hunted together, destroyed my life, and were now picking over the bones. "I am here about the will, Jacqueline," I said, cutting through the pretense, "and to arrange a schedule to see my daughter. The rest is just noise." Her smile tightened. The mask had cracked just for a second. Of course. We'll have our lawyers talk. After all, we only want what's best for Stella. I looked at the little girl sitting at the far end of the long, polished table, quietly pushing food around her plate, a lonely island in this vast, cold house. And for the first time, a truly terrifying question surfaced in my mind. What was best for her? And who was I to her, really? I was just a ghost who sent expensive birthday presents, a face on a screen, a father in name only. And as I sat there in the house of my enemy, I had the sinking feeling that was exactly how they wanted it to stay. The law office of Arthur Abernathy was a sanctuary of integrity in a town built on backroom deals. It was located on the second floor of a historic brick building, the kind with wavy, original glass in the windows. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit with the smell of old paper, leather-bound books, and lemonwood polish. It was the smell of stability, of a world that operated on principles, not whims. A kindly, white-haired receptionist led me down a hallway lined with portraits of stern-looking men in powdered wigs. She knocked softly on a heavy oak door. "Mr. Abernathy, Mr. Reed is here." The door opened and Arthur stood there. He was in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that were a startlingly clear blue, magnified by thick glasses. They were kind eyes, but they didn't miss a thing. He wore a slightly rumpled tweed jacket, a relic from another era. "Oliver, my boy," he said, his voice a warm, gravelly baritone. He pulled me into a brief, fatherly hug that felt more genuine than anything I'd experienced in the last 24 hours. "I am so sorry about your mother. She was a rare and wonderful woman." "Thank you, Arthur. It's good to see you." Come in," he said, ushering me into an office that looked like it hadn't been changed since the 1970s. Books were piled everywhere, overflowing from shelves and stacked on the floor. "There's someone here I'd like you to meet. My new associate. She's been a tremendous help with your mother's case." He gestured towards a large leather armchair facing his desk. As the chair swiveled around, my breath caught in my throat. It was Brooke. The braces were gone. The messy ponytail had been replaced by a sleek, dark bob that framed a face that had shed its teenage softness for a sharp, intelligent beauty. She was wearing a tailored navy blue pantsuit, the picture of professional confidence. But her eyes were exactly the same. They held the same warmth, the same startling clarity I remembered from that faded photograph on my mother's mantel. "Oliver," she said, her voice calm and even, but with an undercurrent of genuine sympathy. She stood and extended a hand. "It's been a long time. I was so sorry to hear about your mom." Her handshake was firm, her hand cool. "Brooke," I managed, my own voice sounding distant. "Wow, yeah, it has. You look different." It was a clumsy, inadequate thing to say, but my mind was reeling. Brooke Evans, the girl next door, was now a lawyer. Here. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "We all do, I guess." Arthur gestured for us to sit. "Brooke has been invaluable. Your mother trusted her implicitly in these last few months." He settled into his own creaking leather chair behind the massive desk, his expression turning serious. "Oliver, the reason I asked you to come in person is because your mother's will is, let's say, unconventional, and she left something for you, specifically for you." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. It had my name on it, written in my mother's hand. "She gave this to me about a month before she passed," Arthur said, sliding it across the desk towards me. The sound it made on the polished wood was like a gavel falling. Her last words to me on the matter were, "Make sure Oliver gets this, and tell him not to believe what he sees." I stared at the envelope. It felt heavy, not just with paper, but with the weight of unspoken things. A key, a cryptic note, and now a sealed package from beyond the grave. My mother had been a librarian, a woman who believed in order and facts. For her to leave such a trail of breadcrumbs meant she'd stumbled onto something she couldn't categorize, something she couldn't trust to anyone but me. I looked up from the envelope, my gaze meeting Brooke's across the room. She was watching me, her expression unreadable but for the deep well of empathy in her eyes. It was the first time since I'd set foot in Port Sterling that I didn't feel like I was entirely alone in enemy territory. For the first time in 5 years, surrounded by the ghosts of my past, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't cold rage or hollow grief. I wasn't sure what it was, but it might have been hope. I didn't go back to the hotel. I couldn't. The sterile silence of a rented room felt wrong, a hollow echo of my life in New York. Instead, I drove back to my mother's house, the manila envelope from Arthur sitting on the passenger seat like a silent accuser. The weight of it seemed to fill the entire car. Inside, I didn't bother with the lights. The moon was high and full, casting a pale, skeletal light through the dusty windows, painting long shadows on the sheet-covered furniture. It felt like a tomb, and I was about to consult an oracle from the dead. I sat on the old floral sofa, the same one where I'd once fallen asleep watching old movies with my mom, and broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was a simple, leather-bound journal. It wasn't a diary filled with daily minutiae, but a ledger of observations, written in my mother's neat, deliberate script. I opened to the first marked page, and I began to read. October 12th. Jacqueline came home with a new handbag today, a beautiful calfskin tote from a brand I don't recognize. She said it was a thoughtful gift from a client. She seems to have so many generous clients lately. When I asked which one, she just smiled and said I wouldn't know them. She looks radiant, but her eyes are distant, like she's looking at a future none of the rest of us can see. I felt a cold prickle on my neck. I remembered that time. I had been working 80-hour weeks trying to get Innovatech off the ground. I had thought her happiness was a good sign, a sign that she was content while I built our future. I'd been a fool. I turned the page. November 4th. She takes her phone calls on the back patio now, even when the autumn wind is cold enough to bite. She paces back and forth by my poor, wilting rose bushes, laughing into the phone. It's a different kind of laugh than the one she uses with me or Stella. It's lighter, freer, the kind of laugh a young girl has when she's sharing a secret. I feel a pang of jealousy, which is silly for an old woman. But I can't help but feel she's living a completely separate life, right here under my roof. My own mother had seen it. She had felt it. And I, her son, the supposed genius of observation, had seen nothing. The betrayal wasn't just Jacqueline's. It was my own blindness. I kept reading, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The entries were all like that small, seemingly innocent details that, when strung together, formed a suffocating net of deceit. A weekend trip, she'd said, was a spa retreat with friends. A work emergency that had her out until 3 a.m. Each entry was another stone laid on the cairn of my marriage. Then I reached the last entry, dated just 2 months before her passing. The handwriting was slightly shaky. April 21st. I watched Stella sleep tonight. She is such a beautiful child. She has Jacqueline's brilliant blue eyes and her fine blonde hair. I sat there for an hour, just watching her breathe, and I searched for a sign of Oliver in her face. A hint of his smile in the curve of her lips, the shape of his nose, the stubborn set of his chin. I couldn't find one. Not a single trace. My heart aches for my son. I hope I am wrong. Oh God, I pray that I am wrong. The journal slipped from my fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. The room was utterly silent, but a storm was raging inside my head. The vague, terrifying question I'd felt in Brad's house was no longer a whisper. It was a scream. My mother had given me her blessing to ask it. She had seen the rot under the floorboards of my life long before I had. I sat there in the moonlight, surrounded by the ghosts of my mother's house, and I felt the last remnants of the boy from the photograph wither and die. Grief was a luxury I could no longer afford. What was left was something colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. I now had a mission, and my first step was to find the truth, no matter how much it was going to hurt. The next morning, I turned my mother's old study into a war room. The room was a time capsule, with its faded floral wallpaper and heavy oak desk. I felt a pang of guilt as I pushed aside her collection of antique letter openers and a ceramic jar filled with old pens to make room for my hardware. I set up 2 sleek black laptops and a satellite modem. The cold, modern technology, a stark intrusion on the warm nostalgia of the room. The contrast felt appropriate. I was about to use the tools of my new life to dissect the ruins of my old one. My first call was to New York. "Josephine," I said, my voice flat, "I need you." "Whatever you need, Oliver," she replied, no questions asked. That's why she was the best. "I'm sending you a set of encrypted directives. I need you to run a deep archive query on our servers. Project name, Innovatech. I want everything. Deleted file fragments, server access logs, IP address histories, everything from 6 years ago, focusing on the 3 months leading up to the data breach. Understood, she said. There's more, I continued, pacing the small room. I need a forensic accounting trace. I'm sending you the details for 2 personal accounts belonging to Jacqueline Reed. I want a breakdown of all expenditures, cash withdrawals, and incoming transfers for the same period. Cross-reference everything with the Innovatech timeline. It will be done, she said. Her voice was calm, but I knew her mind was already working, mapping out the digital pathways. For the next several hours, I worked in a state of feverish concentration. I was no longer a grieving son or a betrayed husband. I was a hunter in a digital wilderness, stalking the ghosts of the past. The rhythmic click of my keyboard was the only sound in the quiet house. With Josephine feeding me raw data from New York, I began to piece together the narrative that had been deliberately erased. It's a funny thing about digital information. People think deleting something makes it disappear. It doesn't. It just unlinks it from the directory. The data itself is still there, a ghost lingering on the hard drive, waiting for someone who knows how to listen. And I know how to listen. Around 4 p.m., I found it. Josephine had recovered a series of fragmented email packets from a corrupted sector of our old mail server. Individually, they were gibberish. But when I ran them through my custom-built data reconstruction algorithm, the ghosts began to speak. An email chain materialized on my screen, a conversation between Jacqueline's personal account and a private, encrypted address. An address I quickly traced back to a server registered to Brad's holding company. My blood ran cold as I read. From j.reed@gmail.com to b.holdings@securenet.com. Subject, tonight Hez buried in work. Thinks he's the next Steve Jobs. He suspects nothing. The server access codes are on a sticky note on his home desktop monitor. Can you believe it? The genius keeps his kingdom's keys out in the open. He'll get them tonight after he's asleep. My stomach churned. I remembered that sticky note. It had my favorite quote from Alan Turing on it, and underneath, the ridiculously complex root password I could never remember. ID thought it was safe in my own home. The reply from Brad was even more damning. From b.holdings@securenet.com to j.reed@gmail.com. Subject, tonight perfect. Once we have the source code, my team can replicate the core function. His little startup won't know what hit them. The market will think he's a fraud who stole our tech. It'll be over in a month. And then you and I and little Stella can finally have the life we deserve. No more pretending. I leaned back in my mother's worn desk chair, the springs groaning in protest. I read the email again, and then a third time. The air in my lungs felt thin, useless. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a conspiracy, a calculated, methodical execution of my dreams, my reputation, and my life. They hadn't just cheated on me. They had plotted my crucifixion. The simmering rage that had been my constant companion for 5 years no longer felt like a low-grade fever. It had solidified, cooled, and sharpened into something new. It was no longer just heat. It was a laser beam, and I finally had my targets in sight. The rage was a live wire inside me, but I knew I couldn't act on it. Not yet. Rage makes you sloppy. I needed a plan. I needed counsel. I needed someone who could see the battlefield with clear eyes. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Arthur Abernathy's office. "Brooke Evans, please." A moment later, her voice came on the line, professional and crisp. "Brooke Evans." "Brooke, it's Oliver Reed." There was a slight pause. "Oliver, is everything all right?" "No," I said honestly. "But I think I'm on my way to making it right. I found something big. Can we meet? Off the record?" "Of course," she said without hesitation. "There's a quiet place on the wharf, the salty dog. It's a dive, but the food is good and nobody will bother us." An hour? An hour later, I was sliding into a worn wooden booth at the back of the pub. The place smelled of fried fish, stale beer, and damp wood. It was perfect. The air was thick with the low murmur of fishermen and locals complaining about the weather. No one even glanced my way. Brooke arrived a few minutes later. She'd changed out of her power suit and into a simple pair of jeans and a gray wool sweater. Without the armor of the law office, she looked younger, more like the girl I remembered, but her eyes still held that sharp, focused intelligence. A light rain had started to fall outside, and she brushed a few stray droplets from her hair as she sat down across from me. A waitress took our order 2 beers and a basket of fried clams to share. Once she was gone, I didn't waste any time. I slid my tablet across the sticky table, the screen glowing with the restored emails. "Read this," I said. She leaned forward, her expression shifting from friendly concern to intense concentration as she read. I watched her eyes move back and forth, her jaw tightening. When she finished, she looked up at me, and her face was a mask of cold fury. "Oh, Oliver," she breathed. These monsters. It wasn't just an affair, Brooke. They destroyed me. Deliberately." "I see that," she said, her voice tight with an anger that felt deeply personal. She pushed a strand of dark hair from her face. This is what they do. It's their business model." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She took a slow sip of her beer before answering, her gaze fixed on the rain streaming down the window pane. "Brad's father, Richard, has the real snake in the garden. 15 years ago, my dad owned a small, successful construction company, Evans & Son. We weren't big, but we were honest, and we did good work. Richard wanted a piece of land we owned for a new condo development. My dad wouldn't sell." She paused, her knuckles white around her glass. "So Richard started a war. He used his influence with the town council to block our permits. He poached our best foreman. Then he leveraged a supplier to file a bogus lawsuit against us for faulty materials. The legal fees bled us dry. We lost the company. We lost the house. It broke my father. He was never the same after that." I stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. The same playbook, the same ruthless destruction. "I'm so sorry, Brooke. I never knew." "How could you?" she said with a shrug, though her eyes glistened. "We kept it quiet. Pride, you know. But that's why I became a lawyer, to fight back against men like Richard and Brad." She looked back at me, her eyes boring into mine. "My fight is your fight, Oliver. Our pain. It comes from the same poison well." In that moment, everything shifted. This was no longer just my revenge. It was our quest for justice. The space between us was no longer filled with the awkwardness of a long-lost friendship, but with the solid, unyielding bond of a shared enemy. We weren't just 2 broken people reminiscing about the past. We were allies, and we were about to go to war. We talked for another hour at the Salty Dog, the half-eaten basket of clams forgotten between us. We moved from the past to the future, from shared pain to strategy. Brooke's mind was incredible. She saw angles I hadn't, legal traps and financial vulnerabilities. We were building the framework of our counterattack when I finally brought up the last, darkest piece of the puzzle. I took a deep breath. "There's one more thing, Brooke." I told her about my mother's journal. I told her about the final, heartbreaking entry. Her face softened with a fresh wave of sympathy. "Oh, Oliver, God." "I have to know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I look at Stella, and I love her. But now when I look at her, all I can see are Jacqueline's eyes and Brad's smile. It's like poison ivy in my head. I have to know the truth, even if it destroys me." Brooke was silent for a long moment, thinking. She wasn't just my friend anymore. She was my lawyer. Her mind was already navigating the legal minefield. "Okay," she said finally, her tone shifting back to crisp professionalism. "We can do this. We can do it cleanly." We left the pub and drove back to her office, which was dark and quiet now, our war room. "You are still Stella's legal father," she explained, pulling a legal pad from her briefcase. "You have every right to be involved in her medical care. In fact, your lack of involvement could be used against you later. Well, use that." Her pen flew across the page. "Here's the plan. You'll call Jacqueline tomorrow. You'll be the concerned father. You'll say that with your mother gone, you've been thinking about family health history, and you want Stella to have a full, comprehensive physical and wellness screening. You'll frame it as something your mother would have wanted. It's the kind of sentimental crap Jacqueline won't question because she thinks you're weak. And the DNA? A comprehensive blood panel is a standard part of a wellness screening for a child her age," Brooke said, a glint in her eye. We'll have the doctor, a trusted professional I know, at a private clinic an hour away, far from Port Sterling's gossip mill, add a parental DNA marker test to the panel. It's just another box to check on a form. They will never see it coming. It's clean. It's legal. The next day, my heart hammered against my ribs as I dialed Jacqueline's number. I followed Brooke's script to the letter, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. A health screening? Jacqueline's voice was laced with annoyance. Oliver, she's perfectly healthy. This is unnecessary. Indulge me, Jacqueline, I said, my tone calm and reasonable. It's for my peace of mind. My mother. She was always worried about these things. I feel like it's something I should do. She sighed, a long, dramatic sound of martyrdom. Fine, Oliver. If it makes you feel like a responsible father for a day, I'll have my assistant schedule it. Just send me the details. She agreed. Just like that. She was so confident in her deception, so dismissive of me, that she couldn't see the trap closing around her. 2 days later, I found myself in the sterile, white waiting room of a private medical clinic. I had driven Stella there myself. The hour in the car was a strange form of torture. She chattered on about her friends, her new pony, a trip to Disney World with Brad. I listened, I nodded, I smiled. I played the part of Dad, but I felt like an imposter. Every time I looked at her sweet, innocent face in the rearview mirror, my mother's words echoed in my head. I couldn't find a single trace. After the appointment, after a small, brave wince as the nurse drew a vial of blood from her arm, I walked out of the clinic alone. I stood in the lab's reception area, the signed paperwork in my hand. The technician took the sample from me, labeled it with a barcode, and placed the small vial in a rack. You'll have the results emailed to you in 3 to 5 business days, Mr. Reed, she said with a professional smile. I nodded, unable to speak. I watched her carry the vial through a set of double doors. That little tube of dark red liquid held the answer that could either shatter the last piece of my heart or give me the one reason I needed to burn their world to the ground. The waiting had begun, and it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark, not knowing if the next step was onto solid ground or into an endless abyss. I have thoroughly reviewed the previous 8 chapters and the detailed outline. I am prepared to continue with Oliver's story, ensuring full adherence to all established requirements for tone, style, character development, and plot progression. The waiting was a unique form of torture. For 3 days, I existed in a state of suspended animation. My life paused on the precipice of a cliff. I stayed in my mother's house, a self-imposed exile, unable to focus on work, unable to sleep. Every ping from my phone sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system, a nauseating mix of dread and anticipation. I was waiting for a verdict on a crime I hadn't known was committed. On the 4th day, it arrived. Monday, 10:53 a.m. An email notification appeared on my laptop screen, the subject line so clinical it was brutal. Lab results for patient. Stella Reed. My hands were cold and slick with sweat. I clicked open the secure, encrypted PDF. The lab's logo was at the top, followed by a clutter of medical jargon and reference numbers. My eyes scanned past it all, searching for the one section that mattered. I found it at the bottom of the page, under a bold heading. Paternity Analysis. The world seemed to go silent. The ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall faded away. The sound of my own breathing ceased. There was only the screen, the black text on the white background. Allele comparison: Oliver Reed, alleged father, and Stella Reed, child. Matching loci. 9 of 22 conclusion. Oliver Reed is excluded as the biological father of the child, Stella Reed. Probability of paternity, 0.00% 0. The number was an abyss. A perfect, complete, and total void. I stared at it until the pixels blurred. The fortress ID built around my heart for 5 years didn't just crack. It was vaporized. The pain was so immense, so absolute, it went past screaming, past rage, past tears. It was a silent, white-hot supernova in the center of my chest, incinerating everything. I thought of all the moments. Stella learning to walk, her tiny hand gripping my finger, pushing her on a swing, her laughter like wind chimes, reading her bedtime stories, her small head resting on my chest. Every memory, Every cherished image was now a lie. A scene from a play where I was the only actor who didn't know the script. My love for her, the one pure, untainted thing I thought I had left from that life, had been a phantom. It was real for me, but it was built on a foundation of the most profound betrayal a man can experience. They didn't just take my company. They didn't just take my wife. They stole my fatherhood. They took my love for my daughter and made it a weapon against me, a tool of their deception. I slowly stood up from the desk. I walked to the window and looked out at the gray, indifferent ocean. The grief and the shock receded, and in their place, something else rose. It was a terrifying calm, a clarity so sharp it could cut steel. The pain didn't disappear. It crystallized. It transformed from a crippling emotion into a fuel source cold, efficient, and limitless. There would be no more sloppy emotion, no more sleepless nights wondering. There would only be a plan. They had built their empire on my ruins. I would build a machine to turn their empire to dust, and I would enjoy every single second of it. Vengeance is not a fever dream, it's an engineering problem. That night, I didn't sleep. I worked. With the cold certainty of the DNA results humming in my veins, I transformed my mother's quaint study into the nerve center of a surgical strike. "Josephine," I said into the encrypted comms link, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Phase 2. Am uploading a target package. Company is Sterling Holdings, Brad's primary investment firm. I need a full vulnerability analysis. Financials, acquisitions, board members, everything. I want to know where the structural weaknesses are." "Already on it, Oliver," her voice came back, crisp and efficient from 1,000 miles away. "I anticipated you might be interested in them." For the next 24 hours, we were a two-person demolition team. Josephine, with her army of data miners in New York, pulled terabytes of information. I, with my intimate knowledge of how the wealthy hide their sins, sifted through it. We weren't looking for a single crime. We were looking for a cornerstone, the one piece that, if removed, would make the entire structure unstable. We found it in a recent acquisition, a tech merger that looked clean on the surface. But as I peeled back the layers of shell corporations and offshore accounts, I found the rot. Brad had hidden a mountain of debt inside the newly acquired company, using a series of barely legal accounting tricks to make Sterling Holdings look far more profitable than it was. It was arrogant, it was sloppy, and it was the perfect target. I didn't want to just hurt him. I wanted to use his own greed as the weapon. I spent 3 hours drafting the email. It was a work of art, anonymous, clinical, and devastatingly precise. It wasn't an accusation. It was a helpful inquiry, filled with specific transaction codes, account numbers, and direct quotes from their own internal documents, which Josephine had skillfully exfiltrated. It was a loaded gun, hand-delivered. Using a chain of encrypted proxy servers that bounced from Estonia to Brazil to Japan, I sent the email. Not to a generic SEC tip line, but to the direct personal inbox of a woman named Eleanor Vance, a notoriously aggressive enforcement agent at the SEC, a digital bulldog whose career was built on gutting corporate predators. The gun was fired, but that was only half the attack. The other half was psychological. I logged into 3 of the most influential private financial forums on the web. Over the years, ID cultivated several anonymous personas highly respected, knowledgeable traders who offered insightful and often prescient market analysis. Under the alias Cassandra, I started a new thread. Subject: anyone else looking at Sterling Holdings' Q2 numbers? Something feels off in their latest earnings report. The revenue from the new tech merger seems optimistic. Can't quite put my finger on it, but my gut is telling me there's more debt on the books than they're letting on. Just thinking aloud here. Dyer, do your own research. It was subtle. It was just a question. But in the paranoid, high-strung world of high-stakes trading, a single, well-placed doubt from a respected voice is like a virus. It would trigger automated sell-offs, spook institutional investors, and start a cascade. I closed my laptop. The first domino was pushed. The machine was in motion. I walked out onto the back porch of my mother's house. The air was cold and clean. For the first time in 5 years, the constant, low-frequency hum of rage inside me had quieted. It had been replaced by the clean, quiet satisfaction of a complex system executing its function perfectly. I wasn't feeling joy. I wasn't feeling hatred. I was feeling the serene focus of an engineer watching his engine fire up for the very first time. 3 days into my silent war, my phone rang. It was Brooke. "I'm at JFK," she said, her voice cutting through the sterile quiet of my command center. "I'm taking a car to the city. Dinner tonight. My treat. Don't even think about arguing." "Brooke, I'm busy," I started, my eyes still glued to a screen tracking Sterling Holdings stock, which was now in a steady, beautiful decline. "I know you are, Oliver. That's why I'm coming," she said gently. "You can't do this alone. Don't let this thing, whatever it is, eat you alive. You need to come up for air, 7 p.m., the Little Owl in the Village. Be there." And she hung up. I should have said no. My mission required absolute focus. But a part of me, a part I thought had died, felt a desperate pull towards that glimmer of light. That evening, walking through the West Village, the city felt different. It wasn't just a grid of streets and a collection of assets. The air was crisp, the brownstones were charming, and the sound of jazz drifted from a nearby bar. It felt human. I saw Brooke waiting outside the small corner restaurant. She was wearing a simple black dress, and the city lights caught in her dark hair. She looked beautiful, and for the first time I wasn't looking at her as an ally or a lawyer. I was just looking at her. "You came," she said, a real warm smile lighting up her face. "You're very persuasive," I replied, and the corner of my own mouth twitched upwards. It was a foreign feeling. Dinner was an oasis. We didn't talk about the case, about Brad, or about Jacqueline. We talked about stupid things. The best pizza place in our hometown. The time we tried to build a raft and nearly floated into the shipping lane. Her disastrous first year of law school. She made me laugh, a real guttural laugh that felt rusty from disuse. She reminded me of the Oliver in the photograph, the boy who knew how to smile. Later, we stood outside my penthouse. The silence between us was no longer awkward. It was charged, filled with 5 years of unsaid things. "Thank you, Brooke," I said, my voice quiet. "For tonight. I needed that." "I know," she said, looking up at me, her dark eyes searching my face. "Don't disappear down the rabbit hole, Oliver. Promise me." "I'll try," I said. She reached up and put a hand on my cheek, her touch gentle but firm. It wasn't a gesture of pity, but of grounding, an anchor in the storm. In that moment, the cold, calculating machine inside me powered down, and all that was left was a profoundly lonely man. I didn't plan it. I just leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of wild passion, but of deep, aching gratitude. It was slow and soft, and it tasted of hope. When we broke apart, we just looked at each other. "Stay," I whispered, the word escaping before I could stop it. "Please." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That night she stayed. There was no frenzy, no desperate passion. It was a quiet coming together, a silent acknowledgement of two lonely souls finding solace in each other. It was the feeling of her hand in mine in the dark. It was the simple, profound relief of not being alone. The next morning I woke to the smell of coffee. Brooke was in my kitchen, wearing one of my shirts, looking out at the sunrise over the city. She handed me a mug and we stood there in silence, watching the sky turn from purple to gold. For a moment, the fortress felt like a home. She was the reason this war was worth fighting, not just to destroy them, but to build a future, one that could feel like this. I returned to Port Sterling feeling different. The time with Brooke in New York had been like a reset button, a vital system update. The cold engine of my revenge was still running, but now it had a parallel purpose, to clear a path toward a future that included her. That made me even more dangerous. I wasn't just fighting against something anymore. I was fighting for something. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my mother's garden, pulling weeds with my bare hands, feeling the damp earth under my fingernails. It was a grounding, real-world task that helped quiet the digital noise in my head. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The caller ID read, Jacqueline. I let it ring 3 times before answering, wiping my hand on my jeans. "Hello? Oliver, we need to talk." Her voice was tight, a high-strung wire of anxiety trying to masquerade as authority. The SEC inquiry and the steady stock hemorrhage were clearly taking their toll. "I'm listening," I said, my tone placid. Brad's business. There are some temporary issues. A market fluctuation. You've probably seen it in the news. She was downplaying it, but I could hear the panic fluttering beneath the surface. I'm worried, Oliver. I'm worried about Stella's future. Here it comes, I thought. The move I'd been waiting for. The support you're providing, she continued, the entitlement dripping from every word. It was fine before, but given the current instability, I just don't think it's going to be enough. She's used to a certain lifestyle. She has needs. I almost laughed. The gall of this woman was truly a thing to behold. She was trying to extort me for a child she knew wasn't mine, to insulate herself from the very fire I had started. It was perfect. Is that so? I said, my voice as calm as a summer lake. What did you have in mind, Jacqueline? A more substantial arrangement, she said, gaining confidence. Something permanent, a trust, a significant one, to secure her future no matter what happens in the market. She was trying to get her golden parachute funded by me, using the ghost of my love for a child as her leverage. The old Oliver would have exploded in a rage. He would have screamed, accused, and lost all control. But the new Oliver saw the chessboard. He saw the queen stepping willingly onto a poisoned square. You're right, Jacqueline, I said, my voice smooth as silk. The weeds I'd been pulling were nightshade, poisonous. How fitting. Stella's future is the most important thing. You've given me a lot to think about. So you'll do it? She asked, a note of triumphant surprise in her voice. We should absolutely discuss what's best for Stella, I replied. Let's have our lawyers draft some proposals. Arthur can speak to yours. We'll work something out, whatever she needs. I could almost hear the triumphant smirk on her face as she agreed and hung up. She thought she'd won. She thought I was the same sentimental fool she had married and destroyed. I tossed the poisonous weed onto the pile and looked out at the churning gray ocean. I was baiting a trap with the most painful lie of my life. I was using the memory of my love for an innocent child to bring about the ruin of her mother. And as I stood there, with the dirt on my hands and ice in my veins, I felt absolutely no remorse. For 2 weeks, I watched from a distance as the fire id started began to rage out of control. The SEC investigation was no longer a quiet inquiry. It was a full-blown inferno, and Sterling Holdings was at its center. The stock had become a falling knife, and every financial news outlet was running speculative stories, quoting anonymous sources, my carefully crafted leaks about creative accounting and shareholder risk. Brad and Jacqueline went into damage control mode. They hired a high-powered crisis PR firm out of D.C. and issued a joint statement, a masterpiece of corporate non-denial. They were cooperating fully and were confident that the unfounded rumors would be proven false. Jacqueline even gave a tearful interview to a local news station, portraying them as victims of a vicious, anonymous smear campaign. She looked beautiful and tragic, clutching Brad's hand on the steps of their glass fortress. It was a good performance, but I was about to change the script. The final phase of the public assault had been in motion for days. Brooke and I had vetted dozens of journalists before settling on one. Ben Carter, a tenacious Pulitzer-nominated investigative reporter for the New York Ledger with a reputation for sinking his teeth into a story and never letting go. He was old school, a man who valued facts over flash. Through Brooke, acting as an intermediary for an anonymous whistleblower, we provided Carter with the entire irrefutable package. It was a digital dossier of their sins. It had the restored emails detailing the conspiracy to steal my algorithm. It had the offshore financial records showing how they funneled money to hide debt. And it had the final, most damning piece of evidence, the smoking gun. WED uncovered proof that a week after the breach at Innovatech, a severance payment of $50,000 had been quietly routed from one of Brad's shell companies to a man named David Miller, a junior IT technician at my old company. Miller had been fired for gross negligence shortly after the breach. He was the scapegoat. They hadn't just stolen my work, they had ruined an innocent man's career to cover their tracks. On a Thursday morning, the story broke. The headline on the front page of the Ledger's website was explosive. The Port Sterling Conspiracy, How a Tech Mogul and His Socialite Wife Built an Empire on Lies and Corporate Sabotage. It wasn't just a financial story anymore. Carter had framed it as a human drama of greed, betrayal, and the destruction of two lives, mine and David Miller's. He published excerpts of the emails. He had screenshots of the financial transfers. It was an airtight case, laid bare for the world to see. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The story went viral. It was picked up by every major news network. I sat in my mother's study, watching the cable news channels. My face, 5 years younger and haunted, was on the screen next to a polished, smiling photo of Brad and Jacqueline. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Golden Couple's Golden Scam." Financial analysts who had once praised Brad's business acumen were now dissecting his pattern of deception. Social commentators who had once featured Jacqueline in their glossy pages were now decrying her breathtaking avarice. The public, which loves nothing more than the downfall of the rich and beautiful, turned on them with a vengeance. Their carefully constructed image, their entire brand, wasn't just tarnished, it was incinerated. I watched Jacqueline's tearful interview from a few days prior being replayed, but now it was intercut with hard evidence of her complicity. Her performance no longer looked tragic, it looked pathetic. The kill shot had been fired, and it was a direct hit. A cornered animal is the most dangerous. I knew that. But I had underestimated the sheer explosive force of Brad's narcissism when faced with total annihilation. In the days following the Ledger story, his world imploded. The board of Sterling Holdings forced his resignation. A class action lawsuit representing hundreds of furious investors was filed. The Port Sterling Yacht Club, the epicenter of the town's social life, quietly suspended his membership. He was a pariah, a walking symbol of disgrace. I was in my New York office on a video conference with Josephine and Brooke, planning our next legal steps when the alert came through. It was a silent, flashing red icon on my private dashboard. Perimeter breach. Executive floor. Josephine's eyes went wide on my screen. "Oliver, security is reporting an unauthorized presence. It's Brad. He somehow got past the lobby." "Lock down the floor, Joe," I said calmly, ending the call with Brooke. "And call the police. Tell them a restraining order is about to be violated." I stood up from my desk and turned to face the door to my office just as it burst open. Brad stood there, but he was not the man I'd faced over dinner. The cashmere sweater was gone, replaced by a wrinkled shirt. His face was blotchy and unshaven, his eyes wild with a potent cocktail of rage and panic. The polished predator was gone. In his place was a rabid animal. "You!" he snarled, his voice a raw, ragged sound. He stalked into the room, his fists clenched. "You did this! You son of a bitch! You ruined me!" I didn't move from behind my desk. It was a solid, imposing block of polished granite, my modern-day shield. "You built your house on a foundation of lies, Brad," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I just held up a mirror. It fell all on its own." "Lies? You're the liar," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You destroyed my life, my company, everything." He kicked a chair, sending it skittering across the marble floor. "Your life was a fiction you wrote on the back of my career and my family," I retorted, my voice like ice. "Consider this my final edit." That was it, he snapped. With a guttural roar, he lunged across the office. "I'll kill you. You took everything from me." He never reached me. The instant he made his move, I pressed a discreet button on my desk. A soft chime echoed through the room, and a small red recording light blinked on above the door. At the same moment, two large, impeccably dressed men, my personal security detail, stepped silently into the room from a side office. Brad froze, his lunge cut short. He looked from the guards to the blinking red light, confusion warring with the rage on his face. "Everything is on record, Brad," I said calmly. "The trespassing, the assault, the threats. I'd say that's at least another 5 years on top of the securities fraud." As if on cue, Josephine's voice came through the intercom, cool and clear. "Mr. Reed, the NYPD are in the lobby." The fight went out of him instantly. His shoulders slumped. The rabid animal was gone, replaced by a pathetic, defeated man. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a brief second before the hatred returned. The security guards took his arms, and he didn't resist as they escorted him out. I walked to the window and watched as he was led out of my building in handcuffs, a pack of paparazzi swarming him like sharks. He had come to my fortress to destroy me with brute force, and he had been dismantled by a plan. The cornered rat had charged right into a perfectly designed trap. With Brad's arrest, the final pillar of Jacqueline's world crumbled. I knew she would come to me. It was her last, desperate move on a board where she had no pieces left. She requested the meeting through Arthur. She wanted to see me alone. Brooke advised against it, but I insisted. This was a conversation I needed to have. A final chapter I needed to write myself. We agreed to meet at a neutral, soulless place, a sterile coffee shop in a strip mall halfway between Port Sterling and the city, a place with no history, no ghosts. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small table in the corner. The transformation was shocking. The Ice Queen had melted. She was still wearing an expensive-looking trench coat, but it was rumpled. Her perfect blonde hair was slightly disheveled, and she wore sunglasses indoors, but I could see the dark, puffy circles underneath them. She looked fragile, exhausted, and for a fleeting moment I almost felt a flicker of pity. It died as soon as she spoke. "Ollie," she began, her voice a broken whisper as I sat down. She reached across the table to touch my hand, but I pulled it away. Tears welled in her eyes. It was a good performance. "I am so sorry for everything. I was a fool. I was blinded by him, by the money. I never meant to hurt you." I just stared at her, my face a blank mask. She pressed on, the tears now streaming down her cheeks. "Don't you remember how it was in the beginning? Before all this? We were happy, weren't we? We had something real." "Did we?" I asked, my voice flat. "Yes," she insisted. "And we have Stella. She's the one good thing that came from us. Please, Ollie, you have to help me. Call off the investigators. Talk to the press. Tell them it was all Brad. For Stella's sake, please." It was the last weapon in her arsenal, the one she believed was her trump card, the child. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a folded document. I didn't say a word. I just slid it across the table. It wasn't a legal paper. It was a copy of the lab report. I watched her as she picked it up, her brow furrowed in confusion. I watched her eyes scan the page. I saw the exact moment she understood. It was like watching a building being demolished in slow motion. The confusion gave way to disbelief. The disbelief morphed into a dawning, sickening horror. Her face went pale, her mouth falling open. The carefully constructed mask of the grieving victim didn't just crack. It disintegrated into dust, revealing the terrified, ugly truth beneath. She looked up at me, her blue eyes wide with a terror I'd never seen before. I leaned forward, my voice a quiet, lethal whisper. "Our life, Jacqueline," I said, the name feeling like a foreign object in my mouth, "was a business transaction to you. You stole my company. You lied about my daughter. So this is the final accounting." I tapped the paper with my index finger. "Your balance is 0. I stood up, leaving my untouched coffee on the table. I walked out of the shop without looking back, leaving her there, alone, with the single sheet of paper that had just officially declared her bankrupt in every way that mattered. The final nail in the coffin came a week later. Brooke called me. "You're not going to believe this," she said, a note of weary disbelief in her voice. "Brad took a plea deal." "And?" I asked, looking out the window of my mother's study at the relentless gray waves. "And he gave them everything. To save his own skin, he's implicating Jacqueline in every single detail of the corporate espionage. He's painting her as the mastermind. He claims she manipulated him, seduced him into it. He's throwing her to the wolves to lessen his own sentence." "Poetic," I said, the word tasting like acid. The two sharks were devouring each other. The fallout was swift. With Brad's testimony, Jacqueline's assets were frozen. The glass mansion on the coast was seized as part of the legal proceedings. The designer clothes, the fancy cars, the entire glittering facade of her life was repossessed. The Port Sterling society that had once clamored for her presence at their galas now crossed the street to avoid her. She was a social leper, a ghost haunting the town that had once been her kingdom. I had won. It was a total, unconditional victory. Every objective on my list had been checked off. The architects of my downfall were in ruins. Justice, in its own brutal way, had been served. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt a cathartic release, a surge of righteous satisfaction. But I felt nothing. Just a vast, quiet emptiness. I stood there for a long time, watching the tide go out. The revenge had been a complex, all-consuming machine that I had built and operated for months. It had given me purpose. It had focused my pain. But now, the machine had completed its task and powered down. And the silence it left behind was deafening. The hole in my life, the one they had carved out of me 5 years ago, was still there. The revenge hadn't filled it. It had only scoured it clean, leaving behind a sterile, empty crater. I had won the war. The enemy was vanquished. But as I stood alone in the quiet house, I realized the hardest part was yet to come. I had to figure out how to live in the peace. The weeks after the fall of the House of Brad were strange. The silence was the most unsettling part. For months, my life had been a high-stakes chess match, every waking moment consumed with strategy, attack, and defense. Now, the board was empty, the pieces swept away, and all that remained was a quiet, hollow echo of victory. The emptiness was a void I had to fill, or it would consume me. My first order of business wasn't about me. It was about Stella. She was the ghost at the center of it all, the innocent pawn in a monstrous game. In my darker moments, I saw her as the living embodiment of their lie, a constant reminder of the depth of the betrayal. But then I would see her face in my mind's eye, the way she scrunched up her nose when she laughed, the serious look she got when concentrating on a drawing, and I knew she was just a little girl who was about to have her world torn apart by the sins of her parents. I couldn't be her father. That role had been a phantom limb, a part of me I thought I had, only to discover it was never there. The love I'd felt was real, but its object was a fiction. To continue pretending would be a lie of my own, a poison that would warp us both. But I couldn't hate her. I couldn't abandon her to the wreckage. I scheduled a meeting with Arthur at his office. The familiar scent of old books and integrity was a comfort. I need to do something for Stella, I told him, sitting in the leather chair that was beginning to feel like a confessional. But it has to be completely untraceable. She can never know it came from me. Not now, not ever. Arthur nodded slowly, his wise old eyes studying my face. That is a commendable impulse, Oliver, and a wise one. He steepled his fingers. A blind trust is the most logical instrument. We can establish it through a third-party entity, funded by an anonymous donation. The firm can act as the trustee, dispersing funds for her education and essential living expenses through her court-appointed guardian, once Jacqueline's legal situation is resolved. There will be no paper trail leading back to you. The plan was clean, sterile, and distant. Exactly what I needed. Arthur drafted the documents. I sat at his mahogany desk, the same desk where I'd first reunited with Brooke, and signed my name on the line, transferring a sum of money that would ensure the child of my enemies would never want for anything essential. As I pushed the papers back across the desk, I didn't feel magnanimous. I didn't feel forgiveness. I felt a release. It was like closing a door on a room filled with painful memories and turning the lock. It wasn't an act of charity for her. It was an act of liberation for me. I was cutting the final tangled cord that connected me to Jacqueline and Brad. I was choosing to be a man who could show mercy to an innocent child rather than a man consumed by the bitterness of her parents' crimes. I was letting go of the ghost of the father I never was, so I could finally become the man I was meant to be. With the matter of Stella settled, a new question arose. What to do with the wreckage? My life in New York, with its sterile penthouse and cold corporate success, suddenly felt like a costume I no longer wanted to wear. And then there was my mother's house. Brooke found me there one afternoon, sitting on the dusty floor of the living room, surrounded by boxes of my mother's possessions. The house was no longer a war room or a tomb. It was just a quiet, empty space, waiting for a new purpose. "What are you going to do with this place?" she asked softly, sitting down beside me. I was going to sell it, I admitted, running my hand over a worn photo album. Sell it and never look back. Burn the last bridge to this town. I looked around the room, at the faint indentations in the carpet where the furniture used to be. But it feels wrong. like a waste. It is, she agreed. There are a lot of good memories here, underneath the bad ones. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the cry of gulls from the nearby shore. You know, I began, the idea forming slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. When you told me what Brad's father did to your family, it sounded so familiar. The legal intimidation, the financial pressure. They crushed your dad's company. They tried to crush mine. I looked at her. How many others are out there, Brooke? Small business owners, innovators with a good idea, getting steamrolled by predators like them because they don't have the resources to fight back? A spark lit up her eyes. She saw it too. Too many. What if we didn't sell? I said, the idea gaining momentum. What if we turned this house into something else? What if we gave it a new purpose? And so, the Digital Justice Foundation was born. It wasn't a snap decision. It was an evolution. We spent weeks planning, sketching, and dreaming. We would transform my mother's home, a place of quiet memories and painful plotting, into a headquarters. I would provide the funding and the cybersecurity expertise. Brooke would lead the legal side, offering pro bono counsel. Our mission was simple, to be the shield for the defenseless in the corporate world. We would be the digital ghosts who fought for the good guys. The work was cleansing. Tearing out old carpets felt like shedding old skins. Painting walls a fresh, clean white felt like erasing the shadows. We were turning a house of the past into a home for the future. We were taking the skills I had honed for revenge and reforging them into tools of protection. It was the ultimate reclamation project not just of a house, but of a life. My life. 6 months later, Port Sterling was a different town. Or maybe I was a different man. The late summer sun was warm on our faces, casting a golden, forgiving light on the water. Brooke and I were walking hand in hand along the beach, our bare feet sinking into the damp sand at the water's edge. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Our life had found a new rhythm, a quiet, steady beat of work and peace. The foundation had taken on its first 2 cases, and the feeling of using my skills to save a small tech startup from a hostile takeover was 1,000 times more satisfying than watching Brad's stock price plummet. You know, I said, looking at the old lighthouse at the end of the point, I used to hate that thing. I thought it looked smug, sitting there all high and mighty. Brooke laughed, a sound that had become the background music to my life. It's a lighthouse, Ollie. It doesn't have emotions. Maybe not, I said, squeezing her hand, but I do. And looking at it now, it just looks like home. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we walked in comfortable silence for a while. The town was no longer a prison of bitter memories. It was just a place. A beautiful place where I was building a new life with a woman I loved. I love you, I said. The words came easily, naturally, with no hesitation or fear. It wasn't a dramatic declaration in the rain. It was a simple statement of fact, as solid and real as the ground beneath my feet. She stopped walking and turned to face me, her dark eyes sparkling. I love you too, Oliver. She stood on her toes and kissed me, a long, slow kiss that tasted of salt and sunshine and forever. You know, I said against her lips, a wry smile on my face, if we ever decide to have kids, I'm thinking we skip the DNA test this time around. Her laughter rang out across the beach, bright and clear and free. It was the sound of healing. It was the sound of happiness. A few weeks later, we were clearing out the last of my mother's things from the attic, preparing for the final phase of renovations. In a dusty trunk full of old linens, I found it, the small, dark oak box that had started everything. I picked it up and ran my thumb over the smooth wood. Inside, the tarnished brass key rested on its bed of faded velvet. You know, I said, holding it up for Brooke to see, I never did find out what this was for. The mystery of it, once a source of dread, now just felt like an unanswered question, a final loose end. Curiosity piqued, we drove to the Port Sterling Savings and Loan, the old-fashioned bank my mother had used for 50 years. The bank manager, a kind woman who remembered my mother fondly, led us down to the vault. The air was cool and still. She pointed to a small, unassuming safe deposit box in the bottom row. Your mother opened this one ages ago. Hasn't been touched in years. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, heavy click. I pulled out the long metal box and carried it to a private viewing room. My heart was beating a little faster. What final secret had she left for me? Hidden bonds? Old letters? I lifted the lid. The box was empty. Almost. There was no money, no jewelry, no hidden will. There was just one thing, lying in the center. It was the original photograph Id found on the mantelpiece. The one of me, my mother, and Brooke laughing in the summer sun all those years ago. It was no longer in its frame. It was just the photo itself, slightly curled at the edges. "That's it?" Brooke said, a note of gentle surprise in her voice. "I guess so," I said, a little disappointed. I picked up the photograph. It felt warm in my hand. And then I saw it. On the back, written in my mother's familiar, elegant script, was a message I had never seen. "True happiness isn't something you go out and find, Oliver. It's something you come home to." I read the words, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The breath left my body in a long, slow exhale. It was never about the revenge. It was never about winning. The whole journey, the pain, the rage, the intricate demolition of my enemies was just the long, bloody, winding road back. Back to Port Sterling, back to myself, back to her. I slipped the old photograph into my wallet and the key into my pocket. I took Brooke's hand, our fingers lacing together perfectly. We walked out of the bank and into the bright, clear sunshine of our future. And for the first time in a very long time, I was truly, finally, home.